On the tabletop today, I'm going to be talking about the three basic techniques that you're going to need for painting: getting down a base coat, washes, and dry brushing and highlights. So today I'm going to be talking about the three big techniques that you can be using for painting up your miniatures. And that's base coat, highlights and dry brushing, and finally washes and shading. If you work with these three techniques and use these effectively, you can paint great miniatures, especially for tabletop quality, absolutely hands down. You do those three things, you'll get some great minis. There are a little bit more advanced techniques, and maybe I can bring up those a little bit later, maybe some other videos, like blending and object source lighting. But honestly, those three techniques, getting a good base coat down, doing dry brushing, some highlights, and washes, you do those things on miniatures, it's going to turn out and look really good. So I'm going to be going over now, sort of setting out your base coats and doing your blocking and laying down the foundation of that. Now, one thing about paints I wanted to bring up is that it helps, obviously, getting it shaken up really well, get this really mixed up. There's one thing that you can use, and that is adding a small bead or something of that sort inside of this to help agitate that somewhat, just like you would with a spray rattle can. Some folks sometimes use sprues, so you can get a large sprue and make sure you cut that off. The important thing when you're doing this too is don't make this so small that you'll actually block up the hole that you have. The paint comes out. So you want to make sure that's a good size. Some folks use glass beads. Other folks sometimes might use some ball bearings. The important thing I want to stress about ball bearings, and this is critical, make sure you use ones that are stainless steel. If you're using, let's say, a BB or something like that, those can actually oxidize and corrode inside the paint. So if you're using metal ball bearings, make sure that you're using ones that are stainless steel so they won't corrode on you. I've got my palette out here that I'll be working with, and I've got my water set up. So I've got my dirty water I'll use for cleaning up and my clean water that I use for mixing this out. And I'm going to go ahead and put on just a base coat for her skin. I'm going to put some paint out here. Now, how thick should your paint be? Rule of thumb is maybe the consistency and thinness of milk. And this is just a rule of thumb. As you're working with your paint, you're going to learn that some have a better coverage. They have a little bit more pigmentation. Some are going to say they have a little bit less. But that's what you really want to strive for, is so that I'm mixing this through and it runs and it's got the texture and consistency roughly of milk. You can see here that that's still a little thick. So I'm slowly just adding a little bit of water into this. Let's do one more drop here. And that's looking pretty good right there. Now, another thing, you probably don't want to mix it up too roughly with your bristles. I'm trying to make sure I don't get the paint up inside the ferrule in there. I'm sort of doing it down the tip. You can always go through and always make sure you clean out your brushes and working with that. Now, when you're applying paint, I recommend working with 2 thin coats. That's much better than just trying to do 1 thick coat. If you put it on too thick, what's going to happen is paint's going to sort of glob up. You're going to have some uneven textures. And so really you want to go for a thinner coat, just doing more coats if possible. Now you'll know that your paints and what you're using and how thick they are. Sometimes you can get away with 1 coat, but typically you're going to find is that the thinner the coats, the actual better coverage that you're going to get and your better results that you'll have. So that's what I'm carefully going through here, is just painting up the leg and just doing 1 section at a time. Just trying to be very careful with this. Now, I'm also going to be covering a little bit on doing some contrast paints. And I'll have a link here to show, how I usually prep those. And that's what I have this one for, is actually it's dry brushed white over a gray primer. But I'll cover that a little bit later on. And that's probably I'll use this in contrast paints on her dress. I think that's worthwhile bringing up because it just seems to me in the hobby now that contrast paints and speed paints, they're becoming far more popular now to work with. I think it's just worth probably spending a little bit of time and talking about that. And so that's what you're just trying to do, is you're just trying to give a nice even coat, and you're just blocking out colors. So I'm just working on her skin here, just trying to get a nice even coat all throughout her legs and her arms, and just making sure I just get a good even coverage. And just trying not to dabble into other areas. Now, how should you paint? Where should you start? Well, typically what I like trying doing is thinking about, a foundation of working from the skin and outwards. So if you look at a figure, you figure, okay, they've got the skin, working with that first. So that's the first block that you want to put on. And then they think, oh, okay, well, they probably have a uniform, painting that next. And then we'll move on to, maybe like his weapon or something of that sort. And you're sort of working your way layers out of the way the model was sculpted. And so that's one approach that you can do. And I recommend probably just trying to stick with that. Sometimes you just got to be a little bit more strategic when you're doing this painting as to, what you need to do and what you need to approach with. I always try to think sometimes that if I've got areas that are a little bit difficult to go and work in with those type of details, then it might be better to try to do those first, because if I work on those details afterwards, those detailed areas, I can have some problems where if I don't paint very neatly, then I'll have to go back and make a lot of touch-ups and corrections. One thing I'm going to mention is that, say, for shoes, these have like very thin straps on that. And I bet you once I start painting these up, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes and have to go through this again and retouch up her skin. That's just sometimes how it goes. So you want to try to sometimes think about how you want to approach that, your skill level. Think about what you want to go work on first, and then maybe approaching some details initially, and then go back with other block colors. But we'll see how this goes here. I have a decent steady hand, but, well, we'll find out as I progress along. So already I'm having pretty good coverage there on the legs. Pretty happy with that. I'm probably going to have to go back and cover this up and get another coat. Just probably one more really thin coat. But that's what I'm just going to do right now, is just work through it and block in her skin and just continue on with that. And so now I'm going to be going through washes. And you can see for her hair, she's got some finer details in there. So to bring it out a little bit, I'm going to add a little bit more shadow, a little bit more depth. And you do that using washes. I'm going to show a really basic technique here. I've got a very dark brown color that I'm going to use. I'm just going to use just a tiny bit of paint. And what you want to try doing here is thin this out quite a bit, much thinner than you would for normally putting on paint. And so, I'm really going to add a copious amount of water. And this is sort of what you want right now. It's running. This is the sort of what you're going to be going for. It's just a very thinned out application. And the idea then is we're going ahead and add this in. And it's very thin, so it's naturally going to go ahead and get into the cracks and crevices of whatever you're painting, and the pigmentation is going to stay up there, and that's going to give it a darker color. So I'm just going to carefully go through her hair here and just add that in. And it's very subtle, but eventually what you're going to see is then the waves in her hair there, that's going to have more pigmentation. That's going to have a darker brown color. And that's a very simple way of just bringing out some shade for your miniatures, is just using a simple wash. And sometimes it's going to impart a little bit more color. You can just add a little bit more depth. If you have a base coat of a certain shade, just using a darker one, or just make that just a touch darker. And this is very watered down, so you want to be careful on transitions between different areas. But that's basically it. Next thing I'll also work on is her skin and go through that. But I'm going to use a different wash for that. I'm going to use some inks, and I'll show you how to do that momentarily. So you can see that I've got that wash on her hair, and it adds a subtle amount of shading to that. Just a little bit more depth, and making those waves in her hair just a little darker. And that's like a nice touch. but it's a little subtle, and I want to try working on her skin and bringing out that tone a little bit more. And I'm going to show you a good thing to use for that, which is what I just used is Sepia ink. This is a very natural shade, and inks are a great thing to use. They're pretty thin. They have a lot of pigmentation. For sure, you need to thin them out a little bit. But I'm just going to use just a tiny drop here and really thin this out quite a bit. And you need a fair amount of water for this. And you can see that that's probably almost too thick here, but we want to just get a nice light shade for that. And so I'm going to go ahead and mix this through and then just carefully apply this out into her face. And you'll immediately see just how it just gets into the cracks and brings out the shades in her eyes. We'll go all the way down into her chest. And immediately you can sort of see on her face just how that adds in more depth. And you can start to see her lips and her eyes. All that brings out a little bit more shadow with that. Now, when you're doing this, it can pool up in some areas. You'll probably can't really see here. I'm going to pull up at a little bit of neck. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my brush and a paper towel to draw out any ink in the brush, and then I'm going to place it in that area. And I'll keep repeating this process. And so that'll keep it from pooling too much. So if I have areas that look like it has too much ink in there, that's a way of sort of drawing that out. Now you're going to see here on our hands, really doesn't really make up much detail on that. But when I put the sepia ink on there, it's really going to bring out the details on her fingers and really make that stand out. And you want to just make sure that you get nice even coverage and going through everything on this. So you can see now on our fingers that really brings out that detail of the sculpt. And so sepia ink to me is such a natural wash. If you're doing certain figures, let's say like World War II figures, you could just wash the entire figure with a sepia ink. It's a very neutral color. It's a great thing to use. So I'm just going to carefully go through everything here and get the whole of her hands and her face, and that should be it for about washes. So I've got that wash applied, and you can see going over her skin that definitely brings out more detail on her face. You look through her fingers, even down her toes, you can really see that sculpt and that detail. And that's just a great way to add a lot of depth. And as I mentioned, sepia ink, I really like it. It's a very neutral color. It's great. If you're doing some historical figures, you'll have some folks that maybe do some Napoleonics. They call it like the dip. It's basically, that's something that you can do. It's a very neutral color. Definitely recommend, sepia ink. You can get it really cheap as a bottle. It's a great thing to use. Now, continuing on sort of with washes, incorporating that a little bit, I'm going to talk about contrast paints. Contrast paints or speed paints, that's really sort of taken over the hobby a little bit. And basically, it's a paint that has medium in it. It's almost like a glaze somewhat. It's very thin down. And so what it does is it provides a combination of really a base coat and a wash. And the idea is for some areas that are raised, it'll be a little thin, it'll be a little bit more transparent. So the coat of paint that you have will be a little bit more translucent, a little bit lighter. But areas that are cracks, crevices, things like that have a little bit more details, those deeper recesses are going to get more pigmentation and they're going to look darker. So this is a way of, going through and basically doing a base coat and a wash sort of all at the same time. And you're going to learn to use paints. I find with these things that you need to just sort of learn to use them, different contrast paints operate differently. I found with these Vallejo paints, they're pretty nice. I can use them directly. For sure, though, what I want to mention is you're going to use a different brush. Here, you want to use a brush that is much larger. It's going to carry much more pigment that's in here. And that's really what you need to work with. You need to have a lot more flow of the paint, the contrast paint, to make it work. And here also you want to try doing is just going through very evenly and try not to go through other areas while it's wet. And so I'm just going to basically work on one section at a time, cover it through as well as possible, and then basically try not to go up to the other area again, because it has this medium that can dry out. And going over it again, you can sort of get a little bit more enhanced brush strokes. You can see here, this is just a very lovely red, and already, areas down through her arm and stuff, it's just capturing a little bit more of a deeper pigmentation there. And it flows very easily, covers very well. And I will mention too that you need to prep this a little bit differently. And I've talked about this in other videos, but I found actually to make it work, sometimes you need to have necessarily a white undercoat, especially for maybe skin tones. But in general, I like to have maybe a gray base coat, use a wash that'll be black to bring out the shades and those recesses quite a bit. And then what I've done here is I've dry brushed this white over that. So the areas that are raised are really going to go ahead and be rather light and allow a little bit more color depth as you put on this contrast paint. And it's pretty subtle, but you can see in areas here, it's got that pigmentation a little bit deeper, and it already has a little bit more of that shading. Whereas if I just painted it with a regular paint, it would pretty much be a uniform color. And so that's what I'm carefully going to do here. Just go through one section at a time and just get this base coat down. And now I'm going to talk about dry brushing. Now, for dry brushing, I'm going to go through two different things. One's going to be like some highlights and sort of showing that. And I'm going to work on the other figure that way. The other one is just like a basic dry brushing and just sort of going through that technique. And I'm going to do a little bit of dry brushing on the other miniature, but it may not necessarily bring out the detail enough to sort of see what I'm talking about. So I've got a Battletech miniature here. It's almost like a board game quality, so it's nothing too fancy. And I'm going to go ahead and just dry brush it out. You really can't see it. I gave this a simple wash. There's a lot of depth in here, but to bring that out a little bit more, I'm going to be using a dry brush just to sort of give a little bit more detail so you can sort of pick that out. So in doing this is basically I've prepared paint. I'm going to use a lighter color compared to my base coat that I have there. And I've already got it thinned out. Basically, you want to have it just like you would with a normal paint. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on a white paper towel, and you're just going to try to get as much pigmentation off as possible. And I get to the point where I think that's pretty, just so you're leaving like a light dusting. It's not very heavy. So if you have something like this, that's way too much. That's a little heavy there. Now I get to the point where I've got pretty much what I want. So now I'm just going to go ahead and just dry brush that. Just a light dusting here. I'm going to be using a makeup brush. And you can immediately just sort of see I'm bringing out a lot more of that detail with that. And this is just really getting over the edges and making those much more of a lighter color than the other areas that you'll have as the recesses. And you just want to use a very light touch. And you can see a little bit more here. There really isn't much detail, but as you're going through this, it really sort of starts to bring that out. And so where you couldn't find much of that detail before, having that dry brush in there really sort of makes that detail stand out. And the raised edges along the sides of this mech and stuff like that, that's going to get much more of a lighter shade as the more I dry brush this here. And so that's just a really basic technique that you can use that's going to add more depth to your miniature. For sure you want to do washes. That's a nice way to bring out some shadows and add more depth to your cracks and crevices and really bring out the detail. And another thing that you can try doing here is just using these is just dry brushing. And here though, that you're trying to bring out is more of the highlights. You're trying to get those raised parts to just give it a much more of a lighter color. And then so you sort of have this transition between these lighter shades to what you have in your base coat down to the recesses that's going to have your wash that's going to be of a darker color. And so that mech before, it's sort of blah, really didn't have much detail. And now, just doing this dry brushing here just brings out a little bit more shade, and you can really start seeing a little bit more of the finer details of that mech just by doing that. And so it's a very simple technique to use, and it's a great way to add a little bit more life to your models. So you're going to see the miniature that I've got here. I've got that contrast paint down, and it does exactly what I wanted it to do. So you can see the folds of her dress in there. It's a nice darker color. It provides a really even shade. So it just covers the base coat and a wash. And it looks pretty good. Honestly, I can just leave it as that. But I want to try to give it a little bit more depth, just add a little bit more shading to that. Rather than just doing dry brushing, I'm going to just use some other highlights. And here I'm using just a red paint. And I'm going to thin this out quite a bit, place it on my paper towel, try to get a lot of that paint off. And then what I'm going to try doing is just finding areas that I think that capture a little bit more light, like the upper folds here, and I'm going to give that a very thin coat. And this is a little bit more watered down. And so you're just trying to just do is pick out some details that you think that might catch the light. For sure, let's say on the back here, the folds of her dress, is these upper creases. That's what we want to try to cover through. And it's going to just add a little bit more of a lighter color compared to the other areas, the folds that are a deeper shade. And that's what you want to try doing is I want to try to avoid those areas, let's say underneath her arm and stuff like that. That already has a very nice dark color, or around her collar, you can see that. So I don't want to get around there, but the top part of her collar, I definitely want to try to cover and get. So I'm just going to use this red paint over here, just along the edge, and it's thinned out pretty well too. Now it gets a little tricky here on some areas that say for shoulder and stuff. So I'm just going to be using it just a little bit more, and a light touch, and it's thinned out pretty well, and it's just going to sort of try to blend in the shades some. And I find that this little bit here, adding this a little bit more highlight, it just adds some more subtle depth to that and really can sort of make that miniature pop more. So this survivor's done, and I've gone ahead, did those highlights also on her dress and finished those up. And it's pretty subtle, but you can see some areas up there have that lighter shade. Areas like her shoulders, her collar, things I might catch more light. I've gone ahead and let that contrast paints in the recesses there just to stay what they are. I've gone also ahead and did the same thing for her skin and sort of did touch up. And it's the same thing idea with that, is just going back to that base coat. Because I used that ink wash, that made it a little bit of a darker shade. So just using that base coat again, very thinned out, just picking out a little bit more highlights out in her face, her nose, some area, upper parts of her knees and stuff, upper parts of her hand. And that adds just a little bit more depth to that. And you can barely see this also for the Uzi, but I've added a little bit more texture to that by just doing a dry brush of a very light gray. And it's really hard to miss out there, but I figured it'd be so subtle with that. That's why I wanted to go ahead and use that battle mech to show you that dramatic way to bring out those details. But that's basically it. If you can get these 3 basic techniques down, get down a good base coat, block in your colors that provides the foundation for everything that you're going to work with, using washes that adds more depth to your model. It adds a little bit more of the shadows and brings out the recesses and details of that. And then if you want to try to transition a little bit more of areas those raised areas, bringing that out more using a lighter color of your base coat and dry brushing that. Just a very light dusting, or in this case here, very thin coats, and this really just sort of capture areas that you think from the top down that would capture that light and bring out a little bit more depth in that way. And so then you get these transitions of colors. It's not just that base coat of red. I've got a lighter red that's going to be up on her shoulders and the upper folds of her dress. And in the folds of her dress, the areas like around her collar, that kind of thing, that's where I have that contrast paint, that dark wash. And it's the same thing for her face and for her lips. You can see that sepia ink has gone down in there, especially around her hands. You can see the cracks of her fingers, where her fingers are. I've got that deeper coat from the sepia ink. But then the other areas, the lighter areas of around her thumb and on her wrist and stuff, I've gone ahead and gone back with that base coat and got that color. And so if you do these things, it's a very easy way to add some shade to your models, to add a little bit more depth to that. If you master these three things, I think very easily you can get some good figures to get onto the tabletop. Next up, I'm going to show you a little bit more on the base, and you definitely need to give that a little bit more attention, so I'll be covering that.